We're going to start right out here towards the back of the barn, real close to the yard. And when you start looking at these rocks here, these would have been dug out of the fields with crowbars, a 6-foot crowbar, and then moved either by hand or dragged with a set of oxen, or they would have been loaded on a stone boat, which was basically a drag that they were able to hook behind the oxen, roll the rocks onto the drag, have the oxen pull it, and then deposit it. So some of these first walls, they were just a pile. They weren't really trying to make anything. They were just getting rocks out of the field. They were cutting down trees, burning stumps, and trying to plant some crops. And so these are the stones that they dug out of the field, and they just threw them on the wall, or made a wall or a pile pretty haphazardly. So when you see this right here, this would have been a cattle lane. I'm sure that this would have been a pasture over here, and I'll show you why. And I'm pretty sure this would have been for crops, and there was another field on the other side of that stone wall, and so there's only a few really old growth trees still there. A lot of it's pretty new, within the last 75 years or so. So that would have been a field. I also know right here, this would have been a pasture, but the next field up would have been for vegetables. I know for a fact my great uncle, when he was here, he planted that whole field to beans, and they would have gone to a cannery. There was 2 or 3 of them within half an hour's ride from here. So that would have been in the 1940s. It's been about 30 years, but I went to college to be a teacher, and there was kind of a teacher's glut when I got done, so I really didn't pursue that career too much. I ended up going a different route. But I really enjoyed different types of geography and geology. And a lot of times people think of geography, they think of like maps, and that's part of it. There's just tons and tons of different venues that you can take when you do geography. So geology and geography kind of went together, and I spent a lot of my time outdoors. I really enjoyed the classes where I was in the woods here in rural Maine and learning about a lot of things. But anyway, I digress. Here was basically gifted to a Major Simon Fogg by the state of Massachusetts in 1814. So he was a War of 1812 veteran. He was promoted to the rank of major. He got this land, and I don't know exactly how many hundreds of acres they were. When I start looking around, I can see where stone walls kind of peter out in different places, so I kind of presume that's probably the boundaries. But I also know he owned all the way across the road and down to the lake, so probably in the range of 1,000 acres, tons and tons of land. So he had a son whose name was Cyrus, and Cyrus built a house, the frame house that we have. And that happened later on in the 1800s during the Victorian time. And so dairy was pretty big then. And I'll get to talking about dairy, but this was pretty much intact as a late 1930s, 1940s dairy farm. So it's still got a lot of those remnants kicking around, and I'll show you how it changed from basically a subsistence farm to a sheep farm to a dairy farm, and then back to like a general farm again, because we have a lot of different things. So stick around, and I hope you enjoyed this video. So you will see an amount of bigger rocks, and those would have just been the result of they were able to get them out of the ground and drag them, but those will always be on the bottom for the most part. But most rocks on the stone walls, they were what they would call two-handed or two-fisted rocks, meaning they were pretty much rocks that a regular guy could lift up with 2 hands and carry here and then set down. So a guy by himself could probably haul about enough rocks to make an 8 or 10 foot stone wall in a day. I can see one of the cows is going to follow me and be annoying. So when I say 8 or 10 feet, I mean about 8 or 10 feet in length, certainly not high. This right here was what would be called a typical stone dump, and I've got quite a few of these. So these were just, like I said, when they were originally clearing the fields off, they would have taken all the rocks of whatever size and just thrown them over the bank in here. They weren't trying to make a stone wall or anything in particular. They just heaved them all over the hill. And at some point in the 1800s, this started to become the farm dump. And if you come down here and look, and I've taken most of the steel and metal stuff and hauled it off to the junkyard. But there's still a few things here and there that you can find. There's still some glasses and some metal things, different odds and ends. There was an old, like a 1930s era fan down here that was kind of cool, but you'll find, in particular, you'll see a lot of these old glasses. So a lot of these are still intact for the most part. And you can see these. So these are kind of cool, and you can see the cans in there. More glass. I found a few broken toys in here on occasion too. So this part of the farm would have just been pasture. They didn't try to clear it of rocks of any great extent. Cattle land I showed you was a really good indicator that the cows or sheep were being shunted in this direction. When you start looking down here in the woods, you'll see, and it's hard to pick it up with the camera, so I'm sorry, but you'll see some, like, this right here is a really good depression in the ground, and I just can't get the angle to see it, but there's a depression here, and then there's a high spot here where that stump is. So these are what they call cradles and pillows. So there would have been a tree here at some point, and it fell over and rotted right here, and then that tree grew out of the old tree. But you can see this mound right here and this hole, so that's a really good indicator that there was a tree and it went that way. And I'm going to tell you that was probably a nor'easter that hit that, because the northeast is coming from that way, heading this way. So the east is behind me to the right a little bit, and then we had a nor'easter here a couple years ago, and you can see this big tree right here doing the same thing. So someday this tree down here is going to look exactly the same as the one I just showed you. You can see the cows come down here quite a bit. They've worn a little path, which is exactly what I want. This is also called silvopasture or silvopasture, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So this is basically a woodland that was never cleared for crops, but it was always probably a pasture. So you can see some more rocks just kind of haphazardly tossed in here, but they never really cleared it. There's just a lot of rocks and stuff. So here's this hole, and this was a really deep hole when the tree first went, but it's been washing and falling down, and you can see now there's a sumac right there growing out of that stump. And what will probably happen at some point is that'll cave in, and it's possible that sumac tree might go this way, and then at some point you'll see a bend in it where it was growing, it fell, and then it changed direction to get to the sun. So it's really muddy down here. This is the overflow of my spring, and it generally stays pretty wet all year round. Even the really dry years still have water in the spring. And it's kind of hard to get to some of it because I had it logged off pretty heavily about 7 years ago. So the thicket, the underbrush, which the deer love, and a lot of the small animals love because they can hide in that low growth forest. But there's a stone cliff over there with a cave. It's kind of cool. My sons came upon it. I'm sure they didn't discover it. It's been there forever, but they found it, and they used to play in that little cave. So as we walk around down here, you can see of interest, because we're down in the woods a ways now. So and this stone wall here has a break in it right there. So that would have been an access to this field over here. Now this field on both sides was probably pasture down at this point, because you see the rocks are just big, and it's not very high, and it's not a double wall, so it's pretty small. And there's a couple things I've been told. One is that the single walls were built within the farmer's property, and the double walls were boundary lines, and that may or may not be true in some cases, but I don't think so. I don't think that's true in all cases. I've seen, and of course the boundaries have changed, but when you get to the end of what would have been, in my mind, the original properties, there's still maybe a single wall, and then these are interior walls, and they're pretty substantial. But trying to get through that mess over there is all but impossible. So we start coming to these stone walls, and there's a few places where I have made access ways to get through for the cows or for my equipment, just because there wasn't any way to get from one side to the other. But when we start coming to these walls like this, you'll see this wall is pretty substantial, and I believe this field we're coming into now would have been for crops. And the reason I say that is because there's so many of these little hand-sized stones in this wall, and I'll show you here. This field is relatively free of stones. There's a couple pieces of ledge in the middle that they would have just plowed around, but it's mostly flat, and I believe this was harrowed and plowed quite a few times. And I'll show you another reason why I'm sure this was a crop field. I'm pretty sure this next field would have been for crops as well, and I know there's a lot of ledge and big rocks in it, and people will say, geez, that doesn't look like a crop field, it's got too many rocks in it. Well, back in those times, they just plowed around them, so they had to make do with what they had, and a lot of this was cleared off. You can see I've had some deer out here, or something. Pack this down. So this right here is a giant stone dump, and I've hauled a lot of rocks out of here for different reasons, but these are all small rocks, and they would have grown flax, some grains, corn. The flax is linen. That's what they make linen out of. It would have taken about 3 acres of flax field to make a bed sheet for like a double bed. So you can see this is just all these little hand-sized rocks. Now if this was a pasture, they wouldn't care about these. And these are all just piled here. So what I also can tell you is that because we live in Maine, we get frost. The frost wall here is about 4 feet deep. Now these little rocks, if this was just pasture, the interlaying thatch of the roots of the grasses, these wouldn't make their way to the surface. But if this was plowed and exposed, these would keep working their way to the surface. Just like my garden, every year, even if I don't rototill it or if I don't plow it, there's still a whole new crop of rocks. And what happens is these rocks are down a ways, so let's say the soil's up here, and the frost will push it up a little bit, and it thaws from the bottom because the earth temperature is about 55 degrees down about 6-8 feet, which is why you have a lot of those geothermal houses. So the frost will thaw from the bottom up. So what's happening is when it thaws, it's thawing down here, and some of the dirt and soil and everything is collapsing. So this rock won't go back to where it was. It may just hit another rock that was pushed up or some dirt, and so eventually that rock is up here, and then you pick it off, and then it just keeps resuming. But all these little rocks are here. There's no reason anybody would have picked these out of a pasture. They wouldn't have even surfaced. They would have picked it once. They would have established the grasses, and then there would have been no more rocks. I never have rocks in the pastures that just expose themselves, especially not these. So tons and tons of rocks. As we start coming along, you'll start seeing that the walls are way more substantial, and they're put together a little bit nicer. So you can see this wall here is probably 12 feet across minimum. And what they would do is they would build a face wall on both sides, pretty nice, and then they would just chuck all these little hand-sized rocks in here. There's just so many, tons. So that indicates to me that probably was a crop field as well, because it's a pretty nice field. Like I said, there's some ledge here and there, but they would have grown on that. And I'll show you some more evidence of why I believe that was a crop field too. So that's the end of part one, and just because of the volume of information I got and the fact that my computer doesn't really hold up much data on it, I'm gonna break this up into probably 3 or 4 different episodes. So appreciate you watching part one, and stick around for part 2 of The Land Tells a Story.